Coming up this episode on the Upend podcast.
Yes, of course, we want to remove police from schools, but that's not sufficient, right? We want to make sure that those same policing functions aren't being fulfilled or executed, by social workers or teachers in those schools. What are the steps towards building futures that don't rely on policing and prisons and the sort of fuel and the lifeblood of policing and prisons and borders, which is, of course, white supremacy?
Families separated through Child Protective Services voiced their anger on the steps of the state capitol today.
They say the system has a history of racial discrimination.
This CPS system is just a part of a bigger system. We have to destroy the whole damn thing.
53% of Black children will be investigated by the child welfare system by the time they turn 18.
The family policing system forcibly separates over 200,000 children from their families every year. Can a system that began with racist intent ever become a system that makes all children and communities safe?
We know the answer is no. Absolutely not.
Welcome to the Upend Podcast, a podcast that looks toward the abolition of the child welfare system, which we at Upend more accurately call the family policing system.
In this podcast, we contemplate the history of family separations in the U.S., the current state of the family policing system, and what a future without family policing can look like.
We're your hosts. I'm Josie Pickens.
And I'm Jason Oliver. Let's get started.
Welcome back to the Upend Podcast. In this episode, we'll be discussing how schools have become sites of policing and how the work towards liberated schools includes the abolition of the family policing system. We're joined today by Erica Miners, who we know will have a great deal to offer us as we delve into the intersections of policing in schools and family policing.
Erica Miners is a writer, educator, and organizer. Their recent books include For the Children, Protecting Innocence in a Carceral State, a co-edited anthology, The Long Term, Resisting Life Sentences, Working Towards Freedom, and the co-authored The Feminist and the Sex Offender, Confronting Sexual Harm, Ending State Violence, as well as 2022's Abolition Feminism Now. Most importantly, Erica has collaboratively started and works alongside others in a range of ongoing mobilizations for liberation, particularly movements that involve access to free public education for all, including people during and after incarceration and other queer abolitionist struggles. They are a member of Critical Resistance, the Illinois Death in Custody Project, the Prison and Neighborhood Arts and Education Project, and the Education for Liberation Network. Erica is also a sci-fi fan, love that, an avid runner, that's also great, and a lover of bees and cats. Welcome, Erica.
Oh, it's so great to be here. I'm honored and just looking forward to our conversation today.
Thank you. So can you tell us about your introduction to abolition and how you came to organize and write about it?
Thanks for that question. And I think it's a really important question to ask because in this political moment, when we're surrounded by so many brilliant, amazing organizers who identify as abolitionists, I think that the pathway to becoming one, it's important that people share those. They're not all the same. And it reminds us that there aren't necessarily what I like to call conversion narratives or like ways in which people just wake up and be like, today I'm an abolitionist, right? I certainly wasn't born an abolitionist. I came from a household where, when I was a teen, when my father was arrested, was a longtime addict, it was something that I didn't necessarily see as a strategy to make my own life safer, but it was a sort of, a moment of respite, a tiny moment of respite in my own life. But as I learned about policing, as I learned about what we call the prison industrial complex in the United States, I began to get a little bit of a critical lens on thinking about prisons and policing. And I started to work, because many of my loved ones, when I moved to the United States as a person in my late 20s. When I moved to the United States, I started to work on challenging the prison industrial complex, but I hadn't heard the word abolition used in relation to dismantling the prison industrial complex until, I read Angela Davis's book, Our Prisons Obsolete, and I got introduced to an organization called Critical Resistance that was pushing us to think about, what are the steps towards building futures that don't rely on policing and prisons and the sort of fuel and the lifeblood of policing and prisons and borders, which is, of course, white supremacy and settler colonialism and heteropatriarchy. So that's a little bit of a journey. And I think I'm still somebody who's like learning and unlearning, what it means to be an abolitionist. I still struggle with those questions, and I still struggle with how do we make our world stronger and safer without relying on, more cops or the cops in our hearts, like in our in all of us. So that's a little bit of a snapshot about how I came to the work, both from a personal pathway, but also from a political pathway, and most importantly, a collective study pathway.
I love that, and especially love the idea of learning and unlearning as we deepen our thinking around abolition, which is what we're doing at Upend. And this season, we're focusing on drawing connections between movements, because I think that is such important work. We'll be exploring abolition from the vantage point of topics like immigration, sexuality, and even international liberation movements in other episodes. But can you talk about why your work focuses on drawing connections between issues like these in your organizing and scholarship?
Yeah, I think de-siloing work or reminding us of the essential interconnections between sites of struggle is so, so important in this moment. Sometimes I think about it as that old, kind of carnival game, the whack-a-mole game, like so many of us, because of what's happening to our loved ones, to ourselves, to our communities, we get involved in a campaign to stop the construction of a new prison or stop the, expansion of policing, or to try to stop the expansion of mandated reporter laws. And we get, we do that work because it's critical. It's like, it's about our lives. It's central work. And I think, of course, we wanna be fighting against that new prison, fighting against the expansion of policing. But at the same time, it's absolutely important that those individual campaigns make the connections between other struggles and systems, right? And that we're, I think about it, that we're also exposing the rules of the game at the same time as we're working on one particular campaign or struggle. So it's like that carnival game, where you're smashing the little whack-a-mole, you're smashing the individual hedgehog. This is such a violent imagery, that pops up with your mallet. Of course, you're doing that, but at the same time, that campaign has to also be, changing the rules of the game as you're going, right? So I think that's one of the, I think, political tensions we face in this moment is how do we do the work that is threatening our communities in the immediacy, in the now, but also see our work as always interconnected with other struggles and campaigns, whether it's migrant justice movements, and also see beyond the artificially constructed borders that have been created. So I really appreciate your focus on internationalism in this moment, because I think that's also central. So I think that, and that's true for all of us. And I think it's really challenging. We're fighting a new prison construction project here in the state that I live in Illinois. The governor has proposed 2 $900 million new prisons. And, one of the big proponents of that is the Corrections Officers Union in the state of Illinois. And, so how do we connect workers' rights and labor movements, with also, not with challenging the prison industrial complex? Like, it's imperative that we see those as interconnected, those movements, that a world for a more just, forms of labor and working and economic freedom, right, has to be connected to also dismantling the prison industrial complex. So, and I think that's a real challenge. So I'm excited for the shows that you're doing this season that are really going to be connecting those movements.
Thank you so much. And as we're talking about overlapping and this idea of like making sure that we are connecting all of these different liberation movements, justice movements, where do you see your work overlapping with family policing system abolition? And particularly, like, what does feminism add to our toolkit as we work to create stronger families?
Thanks for that. I mean, I think some of the key architects of how we think about abolitionists today are people who came into the work, because of their analysis, investment, experience with what we now would call the family policing system or the family regulation system. I think about the brilliance of, scholars like Dorothy Roberts, right? I think there's a whole history of sort of Black feminist thought that has been, paying critical attention to, the importance of seeing, how the prison industrial complex is lived in the lives of, women of color in particular, but families, and what we think about as often private or domestic arrangements, right? So I think that, we don't have, sort of point blank, we don't have an abolitionist movement in this moment without that genealogy, that history of Black feminist organizing and Black feminist organizing that has been challenging the ways in which, Black families have been policed, regulated, dispossessed, disenfranchised, right? And, not just Black families, but I think I'm just lifting up that core, in this conversation today, but also thinking about the work of Indigenous scholars. I'm also thinking about the brilliance of so many, in particular, Black feminist and women of color feminist organizers. So for me, I think that work was really instrumental in, as I began to think about abolitionist organizing and the prison industrial complex in the United States. But when I started to get involved in what was called abolitionist, kind of campaigns, maybe 20 odd years ago, almost always the campaigns that were most visible as abolitionist campaigns or even proto-abolitionist campaigns were ones around policing in prisons. And, those were incredible campaigns and important work, but always other work that was challenging, the foster care system or advancing, reproductive justice, or work that was, I think about early work from my dear comrade, Charity Tolliver in the state of Illinois that was, raising the visibility of the criminalization of co-sleeping, which, we couldn't get bodies out for those kinds of campaigns. We couldn't get as many people, to turn out for those kinds of initiatives. So I think for me, it was an early, kind of paying attention to where people showed up, how people defined what was like important harm to intervene around. I think that's always been, I think, a challenge in any movement and in any organizing. But yeah, so, and also, another realm of work that I, have done, have spent years working in relation to is young people and working in relation to young people and schooling, and the prevalence of family policing or the ways in which young people's lives were, hyper-regulated and coerced, the ways in which policing surfaced, of course, as uniformed police officers in those spheres, but also, as another comrade of mine calls it, like cops and cardigans, right? Or, cops and blazers. So thinking about how young people were negotiating, especially young queer people, young people with disabilities, and or, young BIPOC folks in the Chicago public school system. And the Chicago public school system is about 95%, non-white. So almost all the young people in the Chicago public school system are kind of at the margins of experiencing forms of family policing. So for me, just to come back to your question, that was kind of a meandering response, but for me, family policing was always present, in abolitionist work. It was one of the reasons that I started to think strongly about abolition. It was those scholars, organizers, thinkers, brilliant folks like Loretta Ross that brought me into thinking about the ways in which the state is trying to regulate and coerce and dispossess, families. But it was often harder when campaigns emerged or organizations emerged, especially in the last 20 odd years I've been in Chicago and Illinois. The most visible proto-abolitionist or abolitionist campaigns have been around things like policing in prisons, and less visible have been some of the work, directly around things like mandated reporting or co-sleeping or what we would think about it in the family policing realm. And I'm really excited about, podcasts like this, scholarship that has really, emerged in the last 5 years that has kind of flip that. And there's so much more work emerging now, and people and campaigns and projects. So but we do need to continually, as you framed earlier, kind of connect the dots. Like how is challenging policing in schools connected, to, challenging mandated reporting laws? Like, we need to be always kind of making those connections.
We hope you're enjoying the Up In podcast. A quick note, Up In is funded through the generosity of people like you who believe that ending the harm of the family policing system will help us create a safer future. If you're enjoying this podcast, we hope that you'll consider donating to our work. Visit upinmovement.org/donate for more information.
You led directly into the next question that I had for you, which was really about looking at schools. So people often will discuss the school to prison pipeline, right? Like, that's the widely used term. And yet you often use the term school to prison nexus. What does this school to prison nexus term mean? And how does a shift in language help us to understand the connections between schools and the prison industrial complex in new ways, right? Kind of separate from this pipeline idea.
Great question. I mean, I think when I started thinking about that, again, 20 odd years ago, I was working at a public university, a working class university, open access. It was sort of my ticket to staying in the United States. I got a legit job. And I was training and working with a lot of educators that were in the wonderful Chicago public school system. And I was also teaching at and running a high school on the west side of Chicago for people coming out of prisons and jails, which I've done for about 20 years. And I, trying to make the connections between those sites, like what's happening, most of the people in the high school on the west side of Chicago, were actively robbed of, an access to a GED or a high school diploma, in their lives. Right. And then I'm also working to train teachers at the other end, and working with people who are teaching in Chicago public schools. So I began to get really interested in what's the relationship between these, major institutions in the United States, schooling and prisons. And, it's not it's not rocket science. It's not a new idea, but schools in the United States have always, undereducated particular populations have always targeted particular groups towards underemployment or the employment available after, full white employment in the United States. They've always tracked, they've always shaped, they've always promoted particular kinds of ideologies. And they've also been sites of organizing and resistance, right? So they've been both public schools. So at the same time, young people in Chicago were organizing, against, and across the country, when I moved to the United States, we're organizing against punitive school discipline policies, like the sort of 3 strikes and you're out laws, that came out of the Gun-Free Schools Act. And I won't rehearse that history here, but and the young people were, using this language. Young people in Chicago were using this language of school to prison pipeline as a rhetorical strategy, as an organizing strategy, and to really kind of galvanize communities to pay attention to the fact that their school didn't have funded sports teams or a science lab, but they had, SROs or, police, throughout the school system, and just as a little side note, here in Chicago, we just canceled with our school board, our $33 million contract with the Chicago public schools, with the Chicago Police Department. And that's because of young people organizing. So I want to credit that, 2-decade-long organizing history of young people, largely, and their loved ones, and some teachers, some adult allies, but largely young people who, that fight, that struggle became deeply visible, in the uprising of the summer of 2020. But that struggle has a long history. So that language of school to prison pipeline, I always think it's important to remind ourselves that young people, use that as a rhetorical strategy, but if we want to use our scholar hat or our historian hat, we also want to acknowledge that schools have always been sites of, undereducation and tracking, and sites where those ideologies of heteropatriarchy or white supremacy are reproduced and still today. So I I think that reminded me to sort of move away from the language of school to prison pipeline, because that implies that, if you just fix the schools, the communities will be fixed and then the schools will be fixed, or that it's somehow kind of linear. So nexus was just a term that I was using to try to figure out how to talk about it differently, how to talk about this relationship that was historic and ongoing and wouldn't be solved just by putting restorative justice programs in schools, or wouldn't be solved by simply dismantling, punitive, so-called zero tolerance policies in schools. That we really needed, as abolition, in the words of the, wonderful, beautiful, and brilliant Ruth Wilson Gilmore, is about changing everything. Right? So we can't just think about tinkering with a few policies, or to come back to this political moment, yes, of course we want to remove police from schools, but that's not sufficient, right? We want to make sure that those same policing functions aren't being fulfilled or executed, by social workers or teachers in those schools. So that language of the nexus was just an attempt to kind of push away from a rather linear and ahistoric and also kind of a superficial response. But I always, want to remind people that the work is also to credit young people who I think have been doing the lion's share of organizing, to remind, us that, that the young people came up with that framework, and they came up with that framework, as a rhetorical strategy.
So I guess for listeners who aren't familiar with the idea of a nexus, to kind of create the vision of, more of like a web, I guess, this idea, if there's a better analogy or kind of mental idea that you give to people to think about it. But also something that I wanted to throw in is this idea of, it doesn't just go one way, right? It's not just like linear in terms of it's not one connection, or you fix the schools and community is fixed, but also the ways that our jails and prisons and these sites of incarceration are changing. So both of our schools and these carceral institutions are both changing and kind of taking on more functions of each other. So the schools are taking on more prison functions, the prisons are taking on more school functions. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Oh yeah, that's such a, great framing. And yes, nexus is like a web. And I think any rhetorical strategy, whether it's a nexus or a pipeline, they're always limited and flawed. And I try to kind of differentiate between the strategies I use in organizing and the the strategies that we want to use to have a more crisp analysis. And sometimes there's overlap and sometimes there isn't. Just to kind of put that out there. But yeah, just to come back to this political moment, I've been teaching inside 2 maximum security prisons in the state of Illinois for about 14 years. And, we have a Democratic supermajority in Illinois. And, now, careful what you wish for. When we started 14 years ago, there were no college programs in prison. Not much was happening. We started this initiative because people inside asked for it. We do many things and we see ourselves as a kind of abolitionist organization in a complicated way. But, now I think we're going to move away from offering, formal college programs in prison because, the state is now sort of, claiming that work in ways that, when we started 14 years ago, we were antagonistic, they threw us out, we were doing, they didn't want us there. And now the maximum security prison wants us there. And our goal is not to be, our goal is to work ourselves into obsolescence, right? The goal, and also the primary goal is to get people out and get people free, right? So when we're not, 14 years ago, that was a possibility because we were, nothing else was happening in the state of Illinois. There were it was one other program way down south in Illinois, but we were the only program in the Chicago area. And, it was antagonistic. It was in contrast with the prison. And now, our governor, the 2 new prisons that the governor wants to build at a cost of almost $1 billion are, going to be programming prisons, are going to have state-of-the-art educational facilities. And you're like, oh my gosh, funding for post-secondary education in the state of Illinois, public post-secondary education has cratered 50% over the last 20 years. And yet, I don't want to live in a state where the only way in which poor working people can get access to amazing, education for free is going to be in the maximum security prison system. Are you kidding me? Like, so that, that deep contradiction, is, it reminds us that we have to stay nimble, we have to stay active, and we have to be, as you were kind of sort of suggesting in your question, the dexterity, the flexibility of what we think about as the carceral state or the prison industrial complex. We have to be there. They're a bit clunky, right? Like they're, kind of doing the same things, the same kinds of reform initiatives. So that's a good thing, is they're not particularly creative. If I can, sound a little catty and trashy about the carceral state, they're doing the same things they've tried before, but they're not static, right? And we can't be static either in our work. We have to always be kind of reassessing collectively, how is this work, shrinking our reliance on the carceral state or the prison industrial complex? Is this work, shrinking the footprint of the prison industrial complex? Is this work getting more people free? Is this work challenging the logics and those underlying ideologies or belief systems in the prison industrial complex? And I think that's something that, we can only be assessing collectively. And I think it's something we have to always be doing. So absolutely, that kind of concept of the prison state, a prison school nexus or web, is just reminding us that it's not a uniform linear path, and education isn't the solution, right, to what we think about as prisons. And in fact, often education is part of the problem of and a core facet, right, of the prison industrial complex.
Yeah, thank you. I also want to loop in family policing and thinking more. I mean, you talked a little bit about that before, but just how you see family policing playing into this nexus and these various connections within, between and among these systems of schooling and policing.
Yeah, I think it's a really critical moment. And again, that's why I'm so appreciative and so energized by this work, this podcast, the community coming out of Houston that's been really pushing abolitionist work around the family policing system. Because, as I was just, flagging, here in Chicago, we've removed the police from Chicago Public Schools, or we're phasing out that $33 million a year contract that the police have with the public school system. But we can't think that the work is done, right? We can't think that, okay, we've achieved abolition. And I think that we have to be paying attention to those deep lessons from folks that have been working against the family policing system for, decades and decades, right? How is that same work of coercion, of state violence, how is that unfolding, in, maybe not with a badge and a uniform, but through different kinds of systems and practices. And I think we have a lot to learn for those of us who are newer to this work, right? Or those of us who have, I've been paying attention to it, but my primary campaigns and projects have not been around family policing. But I think we have to be, otherwise, we need to see ourselves in this work for the long haul and the long struggle. And we know that the prison industrial complex is going to be able to reform and reconfigure. So if we're not going to have cops in schools, but we're going to have social workers who are doing those same practices of sanctioning, and I think that the ways in which the prison industrial complex is able to reform, right, to be able to reconfigure and to, kind of emerge in new kinds of state formations. So what we don't want in this moment is like social workers in schools that are sanctioning, that are making decisions about young people's fitness and well-being and home lives, right? Which we've had that for decades, right? But without the police in schools, even some of the campaigns that we ran, 20 years ago were counselors, not cops, right?
Right.
I think that that was a dangerous campaign to run. So one of the but now we're seeing people sort of turning to that and saying, well, we need more school counselors. Well, of course we do, but of course people need affirming mental health support and services, but, careful, we need to be paying very careful attention to what what that looks like, who's sitting at the table, what the language is, where the resources are going. So I just want to lift up that kind of long haul struggle kind of work in this moment. So really, really important.
Yeah, it's so hard to get into the nuances of the counselors, not cops. And but also, right, some counselors are cops. And so it can't just be a one for one replacement thing. We have to change everything, as you mentioned earlier. We've talked about mandated reporting. This is something that comes up a lot. And I know that you've written about. We talked about it last season in our episode about repealing CAPTA, which is the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act. What advice would you give teachers and community members to help them challenge mandated reporting and rethink their own involvement?
Yeah, I'm so appreciative that you're bringing up that question. And I think there's so many more resources and networks in this moment. So what I'll offer for social workers and school, paraprofessionals, is to, don't feel like you're alone. There's so many more resources and networks of groups that are, working against mandated reporting in this moment. So I think that's the first thing is Google, go online, social workers against mandated reporting, the network of folks that are putting out, podcasts and blogs, against mandated reporting. I think that's really, and people who are coming up with the language about mandated supporting, right, versus mandated reporting, right? So I think there's resources out there. So I think it's important to lead with that, just to remind people you're not alone, resources out there. And I think this is also, I think the lift for people sometimes is a high bar lift. It's oh my God, I'm going to get arrested. I'm going to lose my job. Right. And I think we do want people to be willing to take those risks. But I also, want us to feel, that we can position ourselves all over the spectrum of organizing. Maybe we're the kind of person who wants to take a high risk. Maybe we're the kind of person who has the ability to take a more medium level risk. Maybe we're really not going to be able to take the risk to lose our jobs. But there's so many, everything from, lobbying your school to get washers and dryers to support, to talk to young people. There's so many strategies one can be deploying in order to, not feel like they have to comply with those, restrictive forms of legislation. Because almost every adult who works with a young person is a mandated reporter across the United States today. And I think that those laws we know don't support don't support young people, can often put young people in greater forms of jeopardy and their loved ones and their kinship and loved ones network. Right. So I think trying to think about pushing back on, mandated reporting laws, and also doing some study here, because I think and forming kind of networks, study into action groups with other teachers, other paraprofessionals in the school. I think that's another way to kind of build up your vocabulary, build up your analysis, and also build up the tools that you can use, in all different scenarios. Right. So I feel pretty, I don't think we're anywhere near at the state level challenging these laws, but I think we're at an exciting moment where a particular kind of professional and advocacy and organizing networks are really proliferating tools and analysis about why mandated reporting laws don't build safety, right? How they're harmful, and what are the tools that, professionals can use to both protect themselves, maybe economically, not to be selfish, but I think that's important for some people, but also how they can support one another to actually support young people and families and communities. So I feel kind of, and I think that if we think about systems change work, right, what we know about systems change is that it's going to take a couple more years of those levels of kind of grassroots organizing, that's honing language, honing resources to be able to then push back on legislation and laws. And I think that's, legislation and laws are sometimes the weakest tools we have in our toolkit for social change. I believe that grassroots movements are, where the power lies, because grassroots movements are changing language about safety, about harm, about community. And I think that's, one of the most, energizing places to be. And then once those kind of, we can percolate and build and forge new languages, new, cultural norms, then I think we can push back on, of course, we need to change legislation and laws, but as importantly, or more importantly, we need to challenge and dismantle the culture and the ways in which our communities, have naturalized. Of course, we need to report to the police. That's of course like we have to do that, right?
When I hear you speak so eloquently about organizing around abolition, I think about even my journey towards becoming an abolitionist and how, sometimes my thinking has been right on the mark. Sometimes my thinking has missed the mark completely. It's like an evolutionary process that we're constantly trying to lean into. Sometimes we're teachers, sometimes we're student. You've been involved in abolitionist organizing and scholarship for some time. How many years now, Erica?
I'm real old. I think it's been about 20 years now, maybe. Yes. I don't know. When you're old, it's like sometimes things are like 10 years ago. Sometimes it's 20 years ago. I'm not a very reliable narrator for you.
The pandemic has ruined everything. It feels like 2019 was a year ago. I am thrown off by that all the time.
I know. I just made
what is time?
I made a Y2K joke with somebody the other day, and they looked at me like they had no idea what I was talking about.
But I agree. I'll say it. I'm old as well. I'm 47. And when I tell people, I'm like, I've been organizing for like 25 years. The time goes so quickly. But, I'm grateful to have had all of the pluses and minuses of that time. Yeah. And I imagine in your efforts over these last 20 years, you've yielded various results, right? Mm-hmm. In your work. Mm-hmm. Where have you seen your work advance or undermine the collective goals of liberation in unexpected ways? Do you have any examples you can offer us?
Oh, yeah. Pluses and minuses. I really appreciate that question. I mean, I think as I age, also, I think I have more love and more deep. I think respect is sort of almost a too superficial word, for holding collectives of people together for study and struggle and practice, and I think that's messy work. That's full of pluses and minuses. That's hard work. But I also, I am consistently, awed, kind of mesmerized by, people's possibility for, growing ourselves in different kinds of ways or growing ourselves otherwise. So I'll just, it sounds a little airy-fairy or flaky, but, I just, especially in this political moment, we got the RNC, the DNC, and, partially I can't give a shit about either one of those entities. But at the same time, I'm also just reminded about all the deep love of comrade love. I'm talking here from, people who've done organizing with critical resistance and all the brilliance that I've learned from people, in the Sylvia Rivera Law Project and, from, creative interventions, like so many networks and organizations and groups. So I just want to offer that as kind of a, I'm a pessimist of the intellect, but an optimist of the heart and the will, right? To, misquote Gramsci and a million other people. But I feel like nothing in our world is teaching us that, that we should feel, optimistic about tomorrow. But I think it's people and it's groups. It's, listening to you two. It's, being, with my comrades that really is actually both sometimes even as annoying and petty as they can be some days that reminds me that, we are the people we've been waiting for and we are building the world that we know that we need now. And as messy and flawed as it is. So, but having said that, I mean, what are the things that I regret, leaning into nonprofits, right? As the entities that we think are going to be able to, I don't want to trash them completely, but, I've built a number over the years with comrades and colleagues. And I think that they're, the nonprofit industrial complex is tense and real. I would do things differently there. I would make different choices about how to mobilize or how to build containers for people to do the work. I think that how do we build political education into organizations? We were talking earlier about this need for being able to pay attention to how the prison industrial complex or the carceral state is deftly always reforming, sometimes in incredibly boring ways, but is able to kind of reconfigure. We also have to have that ability to be able to kind of reconfigure and have an analysis. I think building, like we often say that we build political education into organizations or forms of study, but often that's the first thing to go because we're tired, we're exhausted, we're trying to put the chairs up for an event, we're trying to, show up for something. So, having an ongoing form of study is actually really hard, right? I think that, being able to, you were talking about this season being about, kind of de-siloing work, being able to, I sort of acknowledged earlier that one of the, teachers, one of the genealogies that brought me into abolitionist work was, folks doing work around what we think about as family policing, right? Especially in relation to young people and families. How easy it is when you're doing a campaign to kind of have tunnel vision. And, I use that analogy of the sort of whack-a-mole game at the carnival, that you get so focused on your hedgehog smashing it down that it's often really hard to kind of draw back and say, okay, how is my campaign or strategy or messaging material or my coalition I'm building? How is that, as we can, as a wonderful, critical, race theory scholar Marie Matsuda said, how do we ask the other question? Well, is my strat like the counselors, not cops? Okay, wait a second here. If we're if we're demanding counselors, what does that actually mean? Who is that putting at risk? Is that like a strategy? So I think that trying to slow down work sometimes so that we're able to ask the other question, or we're able to, kind of have study. And sometimes we can't, sometimes, I was also involved in early restorative justice mobilizing, which I still, think has political teeth and power, but the ability of the state to kind of co-opt work, now the Chicago Police Department has an Office of Restorative Justice, right?
They would call it restorative discipline or something.
I think they call it restorative justice, actually. I think the school system calls it restorative discipline or something. Maybe they do. The ability, how do we, and sometimes we hang on to things a little too long because we feel like, we did that work, we believe in that, but being able to sort of let go. So those are some pluses and minuses. Not that it's like a ledger, it's only a bit of a ledger sheet and accounting, but yeah.
I love that idea of how do we ask the other question? And it kind of, I think, in a broad way leads to the next question that I have for you when we're talking about movement storytelling or just storytelling altogether. The stories that capture our attention are often focused on exceptionality, the adolescent in handcuffs, the parent arrested for stealing diapers, the quote unquote nonviolent offender who dies in jail. What dangers does this create, in your opinion?
Yeah, that's again great question. So many yes and no. It's like a little bit of a, my bad language here today, but kind of like a gateway drug, can get, and I think mainstream media loves those kinds of examples. But, they often don't lead us to a structural or a systemic analysis, right? Especially when they come through mainstream media outlets. Then we focus on the individual and we see this individual as they made bad choices or they need fixing or they need support rather than systems or structures, right? And also systems and structures that are, built by design, right? They're not somehow arbitrary or accidental. They're actually, these are these are systems that have been actively, we have a family policing system because we have directly funneled money towards investigations, towards a a surveillance apparatus, right? That's not at all about, giving resources to people who are in need of resources, but it's about, policing and punishment and surveillance. So I think that often, these story can evoke sympathy or empathy or feelings that are actually about individuals, not systems and structures, and not systems and structures that are actually, by design, about punishment, or about harm, and I think mainstream media does that, and I'm differentiating between mainstream media and alternative or left media, because I think left or alternative or independent media has often tried to push on this a little bit, and get us to try to see systems and structures, sometimes through individual stories. And I think mainstream media, as opposed to independent or autonomous media, often uses what the state's language, right? So they use this language of like child welfare, for example, and I think that, or they use the language of, like the state's language, like violent or nonviolent offenders, right? And I think that creates another gloss or framework that's actually hard then for a reader or somebody who's trying to learn something, because, then we're kind of trapped within the, the fun house, if I can go back to another carnival metaphor of mirrors, right? Where you're like, what's that? I think what, we want readers to see, of course, how those systems, or we want audiences, public, everyone to see how these systems and structures that are created by us to punish, right, or by our elected officials and our systems, and are not new, are kind of old stories, right, harm individuals. So I don't think we want to lose individuals and lose the differential impact on different kinds of individuals. Everyone is not like, that's why I try to not, the language of mass incarceration often implies kind of, it's like, arbitrary, but it's actually, instead of mass incarceration, I like targeted criminalization or targeted, punishment, right? So I think we don't want to lose, the harm that, real people, experience in these systems. And so I think we do want to have storytelling and narrative, because I think that is, critically important, but we also want storytelling and narrative and experiences that, doesn't use the state's language, changes the state's language, right? And uses language that actually points to, systems and structures and histories, and also, points to the rules of the game, right? To come back to that funhouse metaphor, names things like settler colonialism, white supremacy, dispossession, disinvestment, coercion, surveillance, punishment, right? You flip it, and especially in the family policing realm, it's like protection or child welfare, right? Or I think those, so I think it's really, really important to have storytelling and narrative, but storytelling and narrative that, uses different language, that points to histories, that, implicates state systems, state structures, and doesn't sort of let the reader off the hook, right? To be, not to sound too, punitive.
I like hearing the reasoning behind as people like introduce or use different language. I remember the first time that I started really, I think, learning about the prison industrial complex outside of the broader understanding of, policing. We don't really I remember Rodney King as a child, and like that being a part of the conversation, like even jokes about all that kind of stuff, right? Like I remember that as a young person, but mass incarceration, targeted criminalization, like I remember it was probably somewhere around 2005, a talk with Lonnie Guinier where she introduced this term of hyper incarceration. I was like, I remember just like taking notes. It's like, what is, just taking all of that in? Like that was really my first introduction to it. But I also really appreciate how you bring in like the lessons and like the storytelling. It seems like you really want to tell the stories of what's the work that's already happening, like who are the people that folks should form and build community with, and starting to create ways to send people in those directions, right? Like you study and track this organizing to dismantle the school to prison nexus, as well as the larger like prison industrial complex. So what movements wins and lessons do you want listeners of this podcast to become more aware of?
Oh, yeah. Thank you for that. I think just language is language helps us, name the problem or name what's unfolding or name joy, but also, build and imagine and build the future we want to, we want to inhabit now. I think about that beautiful line by Gloria Anzaldúa that, the first, place that revolutions start is the ideas in our head, right? So I think abolitionist work has been really about imagining something different, right? Imagining, and giving people tools to imagine. Most of us, have our imaginations are so, colonized that it's hard to imagine. I think about myself as a kid, like a world without police. You might have, suggested that the world was flat, right? Like, because there wasn't any tool. I might have been uncomfortable, or they didn't make me safe, but it was harder. It was hard as a kid to imagine them not there because there wasn't a lot of tools. So one of the reasons I moved into things like sci-fi as a teenager is because it was like offering these like amazing alternative universes where anything was imaginable and possible. So I think that just that point you made about language is really important, and imagining something different. And sometimes, especially as we go into, God knows what other kind of fucking regime in the United States. And I'm just thinking about the backlash against like so-called wokeism or PCism or whatever. Like, I think it's because people are really afraid of the power of language. And I want to say, yeah, hot damn. Yes, of course I want you to pay attention to the words you're using. And I want somebody to check me on my language, like, because it matters, because it is part of this ecosystem of cultivating or giving people the myself included, the little kernels to imagine something goddamn different, right? So I think that is so central and worth fighting for, of course. So just and now I'm going to come back to your question about you had a great question, and I was like, I got stuck on the language point. So it was something, if you give me like 2 words, I'll
the like movements, wins, lessons you think we should become more aware of.
I mean, again, coming back to my other theme, I'm old now. So I think it's fucking long haul work. It's long haul work, which doesn't mean that we don't have joy and we don't. And I think that how we think about, how we're taught to think about social movements and social movement history is that it's like big wins or big campaigns. And, I think about, one of the joys in doing abolition feminism now and reflecting on that was that, the last chapter in that book is a little bit about Chicago, where 2 of our authors, Beth and myself, live. And, we've both been involved in kind of different kinds, overlapping and different kinds of grassroots organizing in Illinois for decades. And I think the power of those small grassroots organizing, like you throw a film screening or like a rent party, right, for somebody, or a party for somebody a fundraising party for somebody coming out of jail that needs like, a little bit of cash, and you make $300 and only 7 people show up, but you do a film screening of an indie documentary about, young people, working, against, homophobia in their school system. I mean, and you feel like, okay, only 7 people showed up and we made $200, right? But those kinds of, that little ecosystem of people imagining something different, with our posters for our events, our, t-shirts, our little organizations that we're trying to, create different responses to, the harm and violence, right, that was unfolding in our neighborhoods, that was not, and experimenting and trying not to rely on the state and the state, kind of the harmful state structures to build safer communities. That I think one of the deep things that I feel like is a reminder to me is that works sometimes when we have our little ledger book, like, or when we're taught about what counts, often that kind of work, that very grassroots, small organizing. Sometimes nobody's a paid worker. There's not like we don't get mentioned in the New York Times or the Chicago Tribune or whatever, but that work, got some money on someone's commissary account. That work, that work stopped that young person from being removed, from their aunt's house, right? Those small things are part of the fabric of are part of remaking the quilt, right? And I think I think that is a hard, that's one lesson that I want to I'm hanging on to is, of course, we want the big wins sometimes, the major policies overturned, the big structural systemic, shifts, but sometimes it's these like, small organizations and the kind of the language produced, the relationships, that matters enormously.
I'm excited for this idea of remaking the quilt and just that as a framing for. I really love that. Along those lines, as we're trying to remake the quilt, but to make it stronger instead of weaken it, what do you think we should be especially wary of in this political moment?
Oh, so many things, right?
Aside from everything, right?
Yeah, everything. It's just, I feel like it's a moment of chaos, which is a moment of like, everything, can change, but also things can just be reconsolidated, so deeply and harmfully. So, I think that they're in a sense, in some ways, they're like old threats, liberalism, right? White supremacist liberalism, which can kind of creep into so many spaces. And, I think just thinking about the work that's unfolding, right now in Chicago and nationally around trying to rebrand the police, right, as kind of your, nice, as your neighborhood mental health service provider, as your nice person who's, working to, address interpersonal violence, right? So I think, in a sense, the things we should be wary about are the things that we always, should be wary about. They're not necessarily new, but they feel, again, in this kind of political moment, heightened. I really appreciate the comment at the beginning of this, that the season is also focusing on internationalist work. Here we are in the United States, or within the borders of what gets called the United States. And I think it's important to looking beyond our artificial nation state borders to see how people are building safety and, responding and learning, and not, we're pretty insular often, people who live in the United States, not always, but we can be. So trying to think about our and learn from beyond that. So those are just some kind of worries. I don't know if they're the top of my head. I'm sure as I'll try to come back to more as the call goes along.
I love our conversations around imagining as a part of the building an abolitionist future, right? And for some folks who are thinking about abolition, so much of the focus is dismantling, but we have to be able to think differently about things. So let's talk about imagination and thinking differently about safety. So discussions about safety often boil down to, it's better to be safe than sorry, right? We hear this all the time. An example, the possibility of sexual violence is often used as a justification for intervention of the state by any means necessary, regardless of potential harm. How can we think differently about accountability?
Great question. I'm going to put a bracket around that because I want to come back to the last one, because one thing that I am really worried about in this moment, especially as it relates to work against the family policing system, is the divergence or is the convergence in this moment. I'm thinking about young, trans folks in southern states, and the ways in which the right and libertarians and sort of the MAGA movement have kind of capitalized that parental rights and are really invoking this sort of privacy, parental choice, and family, and pushing against family separation, or making the argument that parents should, that parents' rights are, paramount, right? And I think that at the very, very surface level overlaps with, some of the, our pushes in our movements to end family policing. And I think it means that we need to be very, rigorous and careful about how we're talking about families, and we also need to, ask the other question about heteropatriarchy in this conversation. Where is it moving? So I just want to lift that. I think that there's a really interesting political moment right now around, pushing back on governmental, incursions and overreach into families, and into family care. And I think that we could end up, in this weird kind of strange bedfellows conversation. So I think that's I think it's an important moment that we get we get ourselves again really clear about, bodily autonomy and what we mean by family and kinship networks, because those of us against the family policing system mean something very different than the MAGA, Republican, libertarian, folks who are also, I think, would also see themselves as against family policing, right? So I think that there's like a, kind of a weird language, kind of connection, but deep political differences, of course, but trying to push, kind of for rigor there, I think is really important. So I was just thinking about that while you were, but your question was.
Oh, and it's happening in Texas. Let me tell you, we might be at the forefront of where it's happening. Like, we see it in legislation that's passed, and many folks are asking, well, how did that get passed? This particular legislation or some of the policy around these ideas that you've expressed. And yes, so it's already here, unfortunately.
So we shouldn't join the school vouchers as a family policing abolition organization. It's family agency, right? Isn't that what you people want?
Yes. Exactly. I mean, that's a classic. I mean, this is an old story. It's totally an old story, whether it's about, healthcare, like midwifery, same example, right? Vouchers, excellent example. All these, like, the ways in which, so I think that's especially, around, reproductive justice. I think we want to use that language, in this moment, and queer and trans lives. There's like a, and young people, there's like a, it's kind of a precarious moment yet again, right? So, and it's an old script. It's not a new script, but I feel like all of us need to be paying careful attention about how we're situated there. I think really important. But yeah, safety and accountability. I think one of the reasons why, one of the first things when I started to think about abolition, I have a, kind of a long history doing work against sexual harm, sexual violence, and when I started to sort of think about abolition, one of the first questions that came up, for me was like, what about sexual harm? Like, hold on a second. Like, what am I thinking? What's going on here? Like, this is, okay, I can kind of sort of understand, especially after I moved to the United States and unlearned, had to learn about the relationship between race and white supremacy and power in the prison industrial complex. I was like, okay, I can get like, I get that, but like, what about sexual harm? Like, hold on, wait a second here. So I had to do a lot of like thinking and, but one of the kind of things that, that came from that study is sort of like the question that you're raising, which is beautiful, which is about accountability. Is that one thing that I know from all of the work that I've done around sexual harm and sexual violence and, the thinking and life experiences is that, the criminal legal system doesn't provide, accountability for people that have experienced, harm, sexual harm, right? So, and what I want, right, and what those of us who want to end, gender and sexual violence want, is the harm to end, right? The systems that made that harm and the people that, the ways in which that harm was possible or imaginable, right, to make that, go away, right? And I think if we start to shift our center of gravity away from the criminal legal system, right, we see so many more avenues to build from and to grow to actually address the root cause of the issue, right? When we're just locking more people up or criminalizing or policing, we're not actually addressing the root problem, which is sexual harm, sexual violence, right? And if we want to address that, we got to actually address that, right? We can't just keep, we're going to hire more cops. We're going to we're going to lock people away for longer. We're going to build more prisons to put people, in prisons, who've done this work, who've done sexual harm. It's like, that actually doesn't hold anybody accountable that's done that harm. It doesn't support people who've experienced that harm, right? It doesn't change the conditions that made that harm imaginable and possible in the first place. So, I think I've been, involved in paying attention to the last, 20 decades of how are people working to address sexual violence and hold people accountable and transform the conditions that made that, harm possible in the first place, right? And I think that is abolitionist work, is feminist work. My definition of feminism, that's feminist work. And I think that's really, and it's not light switch work, it's not, immediate conversion work, but I think it's really important work. And I think, and sometimes it's, preventative work. Like I think like in this moment, if we had meaningful and affirming, sexual health education in public school system, how would that act as a deterrent, as a protective, move, right? But we don't have that anywhere in the United States, right? So, there are some things that are kind of not rocket science here that can actually work to reduce, incidents of particularly child sexual harm, but sexual harm in the United States, and we don't have any. We're not doing it, right? So I think if we really want to be accountable and we really want to end gender and sexual harm and we really want to, build our abolitionist worlds, we need to be addressing the root, asking the important questions like, why do we have, gender and sexual harm, not masking it, through our criminal legal system, which the criminal legal system response is we're just going to hire more cops. We're going to have more surveillance cameras. We're going to have longer sentences. We're going to punish people longer. And none of those act as deterrent. We're going to build more registries so we can track people, right? And none of those are actually, addressing the root problems. So abolitionist work, abolition feminist work, is really getting us to try to pay attention to that, and ask those questions. And then what do we do? Right. And again, that's not rocket science. It's not new. I feel like I'm using rocket science here totally, loosely. I'm knowing no idea what it is. That's work that people have always done. Many communities could never rely on the criminal legal system, right? To build safety, to address harm in their communities, sex workers, people who are undocumented, queer communities, people who are already targeted for, eradication by the police. And it's not that what those communities developed was necessarily the solution, but there is a history of people experimenting, practicing, trying other forms of accountability. Like, what do you do, with somebody in your network that's really harmful, right? Or has done harm, like, and you can't expel them or you can't, send them away. What do you do? Like, so I think that we have those histories to learn from, to build on, to continue experimenting. I think that's the abolitionist vision or the world that, that is both energizing to me. And I think many of us.
I hope people are taking this as an invitation, right? I think it's clear that you cover a lot of the things that we'll be discussing throughout this entire season, right? Like, so much of this ties into your work directly, and we can't talk about it in one episode, especially one episode that's really looking at it specifically through the lens of like schools and that as an entry point, even though schools touch everything. So I want to invite people to like engage with you more broadly. Where can people find you and how can they stay connected with you and your work, Erica?
I am funny and, introverted and, tall or whatever, but I think it's not me, right? I don't want to say, I want to push people there's so many amazing resources, whether it's organizations like, Critical Resistance, whether it's organizations like the Dream Defenders, whether it's work like the Movement for Family Power in New York. There's just so many. I think we want to be moving away from people, no individual is going to save us, but groups of people, and their thinking and their collective practice and their strategies and campaigns and experimentation. Check out if you're interested in transformative justice, check out the amazing work from the Storytelling and Organizing Project and Creative Interventions that offer real examples of what people tried, when shit went down, what did they try when they didn't call the cops and how'd that work out, right? Check out the great blog posts from the Black on Both Sides folks here. There's just so many great organizations. And I think in this moment, we're a little hyper reliant on individuals, and, no one person had ever saved us, right? Not that you're suggesting that I can save anybody, but I would encourage people to, get active, get collective, right? Get a study into action group going, pick up something, cool to read, whether it's, or it's cool to listen to, like these podcast episodes, right? And discuss them, get together. How is this connected to our practice? How is this connected to what's unfolding in our community, in our job? What do we got to unlearn? What do we got to, thinking about that, old, framework that we used in critical resistance? What do we need to dismantle? What do we need to change about ourselves, and what do we need to build, right? Like, how do we think about that dismantle, change, build framework as we move through the world? So I think, and also have some fun, like get some food, get a little cocktail / mocktail, just, have some joy, because I think it's also long haul work. So find your people, whether you're in a church basement, a professional organization, your basement of your building, in hot, sweaty Chicago, as I am today, find your people and, study into struggle and to action together.
I love that. I love how you took my question of where can people find you and turned it around to the audience, where can you find your people, right? Like, this is a question and a call to action for the audience. Where can you find your people? And gave like practical steps to take to do that. So thank you, Erica. We really appreciate you. Oh, yep.
Also recruit. Also, you can recruit too, right? You can find your people and you can recruit.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah.
Find your people and find more people, and have your people find other people.
Because look how good looking, smart, funny, amazing we are. Like, we're eminently recruitable, right? And who's not going to be like swayed by us, right? Like, what is that Tony Cade Bambara line? We are making the revolution irresistible every day.
Yes, that is it. That's it.
I love that. Well, thank you, Erica. We really appreciate you coming and joining us on the podcast. This has been wonderful.
Yes, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for joining us for the Upend podcast as we explore family policing system abolition. To learn more about Upend and our work to strengthen families and communities, visit our website at upendmovement.org and follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Upend Movement.